There's been a lot of bad things in this series. There's been a lot of stupid things. There's been a lot of damage done to MCU continuity from retcons. There's been a lot of MCU garbage that no one wants to see. You might think the final episode, the writers would try to deliver a good product and go out strong, but that's not what's going to happen. They're going to double down on all the mistakes that they've been making for the entire series, and they're going to make Nick Fury look even more sad and pathetic than he ever has been before. Secret Invasion is bad. Episode 6. We begin with some of the Skrulls standing guard outside their facility. The car turns around the corner and very slowly starts making its way towards the gate. The guards yell at the car, telling the driver to stop, but when it doesn't, they start shooting at it. Then the car very obviously hits the brakes, and we know this because it makes a squealing noise, only to discover that somehow there was no driver inside after all. Then both of the guards are suddenly shot by someone off camera, which turns out to be Nick Fury. I have a few questions I'd like to ask about this scenario. I'd like to know how the car managed to turn the corner and then brake at the appropriate time all by itself. Maybe if it had been a Tesla with auto driving, then sure. But this is just some old-ass station wagon. I guess Nick Fury could have put a brick on the gas pedal, but that still doesn't explain how it was able to turn around a corner and then come to a stop a little bit later on.
I don't get it.
Already, this episode is starting out with some pretty quality writing. Back at the hospital, the president is still trying to recover, and Fem Rhodey is desperately trying to convince him that the Skrulls and the Russians are working together and that a retaliatory strike must be made. Fem Rhodey gets a call from the annoying lady who says that Nick Fury is in the building and he's going to make an attempt on the president. This is obviously a lie. She was just with Nick Fury. She knows that Fem Rhodey is actually a Skrull, and also, we just saw Nick Fury over at the Skrull base, so how can he possibly be in the hospital if he's also at the Skrull base? We'll find out a little bit more about that later on, and it's gonna be really dumb. Really, really dumb.
He's testing even my limits.
In response, Fem Rhodey takes the president out of his room and brings him to another part of the hospital where he can be better protected. Meanwhile, Nick Fury is stumbling through the facility and finally comes across Gravik at the Super Skrull machine. Fury is coughing and shaking because of the intense radiation at the facility. While the Skrulls are immune to this kind of radiation, humans very obviously are not. However, even if there was intense radiation, it wouldn't elicit a response this quickly from Nick Fury. So, no, this is not how it works. Then Gravik goes on this really long rant about how he believed in Fury and he feels that he was betrayed because Nick Fury didn't keep his promise. Let me remind you that the promise Nick Fury made was that he would help the Skrulls find another planet for them to live on. Something that Nick Fury and the American population, the Earth population in the late 90s would be completely and totally incapable of doing. Even present-day humans in the MCU still are not able to do that. So this promise seems kind of dumb. Once again, want to point that out.
Am I right?
Nick Fury responds by giving a sob story about how he feels really bad, and because of that, he's going to willingly give Gravik the harvest, which includes all the DNA from the Avengers and Captain Marvel. This doesn't seem like a very good idea. This is really stupid, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. He does try to make a deal with Gravik, however, that if he hands over the harvest, the only thing he wants in exchange is for Gravik and the Skrulls to go and find some other planet rather than making war on Earth. And of course, they already know of another planet. This is the one that Thanos was living on. The Avengers knew about this. Captain Marvel knew about this. Nick Fury knew about this when he came back. I mean, basically, anybody that was connected to the Avengers in any way, shape, form, or fashion would have known about the trip that some of the Avengers took to go and deal with Thanos after the snap, but I guess the Skrulls just don't like that planet. It's not good enough for them, or maybe the writers just forgot about it, which is probably more likely.
These are the people who don't actually have the talents, so they compensate by pretending that they're being bad on purpose.
Meanwhile, back at the hospital, someone is quietly taking out the security guards, although I need to point out there seems to be a distinct lack of blood when each of these guards gets taken out. Femroti is searching the room when he's confronted by the annoying lady, who then takes him captive. Once again, going back to the Skrull facility, Gravik puts all of the DNA into the machine and turns it on. When the light disappears, Gravik is back to his normal form, except significantly more muscled. He tries to punch Nick Fury, but Nick Fury grabs his hand and starts pushing it back. It's then revealed, surprise, it was Dani pretending to be Nick Fury. And because she was standing in the machine, she also gained all the powers of every single Avenger, plus Captain Marvel, plus all these other superpowered beings that they had the DNA for and all this. She has all of the powers, just like Gravik does. However, she has one thing that Gravik doesn't have. She's a woman.
Obi, when it fits a woman.
And that means that things are about to get very MCU. We also happen to be blessed with this unbelievably awful CGI. I mean, even compared to She-Hulk, this looks fucking terrible. During the fight, both of them use a variety of different superpowers from previous characters, and at one point, Gravik replicates what appears to be the hand of Ebony Maw. That's the wizard guy who worked for Thanos. However, there were a couple of problems with Gravik trying to use his powers, and firstly, it's because Ebony Maw doesn't actually have any powers. All of the stuff that he does is through the use of magic. There is absolutely nothing in his DNA that would have been transferred over to Gravik because Ebony Maw's powers are derived from magic, which is a source outside of his body. Just taking his DNA would do nothing. I guess the writers didn't really care to pay attention to that.
But I had no idea they were this stupid.
The second stupid thing about this is that when Gravik recreates Ebony Maw's hand, he also recreates the rings that Ebony Maw had been wearing. Now, you could argue that this is just part of Gravik's own shapeshifting, but how would he even know? He never saw Ebony Maw. He never saw the character wearing those rings. How would Gravik know to create those specific-looking rings on Ebony Maw's hand? So are we to assume that the magic that Ebony Maw was using is part of his DNA, and also the fucking rings he was wearing are also part of his DNA? That's not how it works.
How embarrassing.
As the fight nears its end, both Gravik and Dani start using Captain Marvel's powers, which I also want to point out is not part of her DNA either. Captain Marvel's powers in the MCU are largely gained from the Space Stone. Again, it's an outside power and has nothing to do with her DNA, which means that it shouldn't have been transferred. Something else that's very important to point out is that both Dani and Gravik are capable of using all of these different superpowers at their maximum potential. In fact, that is how Dani is able to finally kill Gravik, by using a massively powerful beam of energy derived from Captain Marvel. For some reason, Gravik just stopped channeling his own use of that Captain Marvel power, which left him vulnerable, and that's how he dies from it. So I guess not a good idea, not a good plan.
How dumb are you?
More importantly, what this means is that Dani is now the single most powerful being in the entire MCU that we're aware of. Captain Marvel was already grossly overpowered because Disney hated the idea of Thor and Captain America and Incredible Hulk and some of these other really, really powerful characters being men. They wanted to have the strongest good character to be a woman, and that's why they kind of overdid it with Captain Marvel. But that's also why she was absent from most of the Endgame movie, because they had stupidly made her way too powerful, and it would have completely destroyed the storyline, so they had to cut her out of almost the entire movie, and she just appears for a few minutes at the beginning and then at the end. But now we have Dani, who is capable of using all of Captain Marvel's powers at their maximum potential, in addition to pretty much everyone else in the MCU. She has the strength of the Incredible Hulk, the speed of Quicksilver, invisibility, flight, extraordinary durability. At this point, there is absolutely nothing in the entire MCU that would be capable of defeating Dani. She is just massively overpowered, and it is fucking idiotic.
You're boring! You're fucking dull!
They have made this character so stupidly overpowered that it is not an exaggeration to say that she could easily defeat a Celestial all by herself. Once more, Disney's desire to push their ridiculous woke feminist narrative is destroying the MCU, because now you have no villains that are actually capable of being a legitimate threat when Dani's around, because she can just obliterate everyone.
Oh, they're going to have to glue you back together in hell!
Back at the hospital, Nick Fury finally reveals himself, and as I expected, he's been using tranquilizer darts to take out the guards, so there's no serious injury. He then tries to convince the president that Fem Rhodey is a Skrull and that he needs to call off the attack. There's a small scuffle and Nick Fury ends up shooting fake Rhodey, revealing that he is in fact a Skrull, so the president orders the cancellation of the retaliatory strike. Back at the facility, Dani is releasing all of the humans that had been held captive, and one of them is Watson from the first episode, and another one is Rhodey. But don't worry, it gets worse. This is one of the biggest retcons in the entire MCU. So first of all of the humans are wearing the same clothes that they were originally captured in, and I'm not exactly sure how they all remain so clean over the years, but evidently the Skrulls did a very good job of dealing with, shall we say, the human waste products that need to be removed on a regular basis. But the truly awful thing about this situation is Rhodey and what he happens to be wearing, because he still has on the hospital gown that he had been wearing in the Captain America Civil War movie. This means that the Skrulls had kept him for about 8 years, and for whatever reason, they never bothered to change the hospital gown he had been wearing that entire time. But what's even more ridiculous is that it still looks like it's brand new.
Weird.
But hang on a second here. If he's been captive all of this time, then it means that everything that has happened since that time frame was not actually Rhodey. Instead, it was the female Skrull who was pretending to be him. So when you saw Rhodey mourning over Tony Stark at the end of Endgame, that wasn't actually Rhodey. It was just some Skrull pretending to be him. This retcon completely annihilates every bit of character development and every emotional situation involving Rhodey. This is yet another example of the MCU writers wanting to include something because they thought it was cool, but failing to realize that it would have greater ramifications on the rest of the MCU. This happened with the Eternals when they left a giant dead Celestial sticking out of the earth. It happened with She-Hulk when they abruptly introduced the Incredible Hulk's son, Scar. Those are just 2 examples. There are a whole bunch more. The next time we see Rhodey, he's going to be in the Armor Wars movie that no one is excited for, not even Disney, because originally it was supposed to be an entire Disney Plus series, but they just changed it to now it's just a movie by itself, and that's about it. One of the requirements for this movie was that he needed to lose the ability to use his legs at the end of whatever Secret Invasion was going to have. So that was supposed to set up the thing for Armor Wars, and we've heard that now Rhodey is supposed to be dealing with all of the issues that came from being a prisoner of the Skrull. Now, obviously, this is not what they originally intended with the series, and since they're making it into a movie, they're just kind of squishing everything down into a big mess, and they're rewriting I wouldn't be surprised if they've rewritten it a dozen times at this point. But he is supposed to address all of the major problems with, basically being a captive for like 8 years in the Armor Wars movie that nobody's gonna watch anyways.
Is that the end of the story?
No, son.
Regardless, the president has now recovered, and he goes on TV to make a declaration that any alien on Earth will be considered hostile enemy combatants, and they will be dealt with. It would seem that the writers have forgotten that there's a gigantic space station being constructed in orbit around the Earth that is mostly being done by the Skrulls, who are, kind of aliens, but, I guess who cares about consistency? The writers apparently don't. Later on, the Annoying Lady manages to track down Dani and confronts her. The Annoying Lady wants to make a deal, and while Dani is hesitant, the Annoying Lady says that she doesn't plan on repeating the mistakes of Talos and Fury, that together they will be able to do better. The obvious unspoken lines here is that they're women and they're smarter and they're better and what they'll do is work and the men were dumb and that's why they couldn't do anything. That's why it failed, because they were men.
Shut the fuck up.
The annoying lady also tries to portray the president as being vile and xenophobic because he doesn't like the aliens, which I have to point out is really fucking stupid because not even 10 seconds ago, a large number of Skrulls attempted to start World War III and wipe out the entire human race, so it seems kind of normal and natural to not like those people, you know, who wanted to wipe out all the humans. I can understand why people wouldn't like them. That seems reasonable. That seems entirely reasonable.
This is the way.
It gets even dumber, though, because Nick Fury then calls up the president and starts berating him for instigating violence against innocent Skrulls, which again I want to point out is fucking nonsense. What the president did is irrefutably the correct response, and yet the show wants to try to paint him as a bad guy. No.
Instead, I'd rather just tell you all to piss off.
But somehow it manages to get even dumber because then we get a couple of scenes of vigilante justice against the Skrulls, and to the surprise of absolutely no one, every single one of these vigilantes turns out to be a white guy. I mean, the writers aren't even trying to hide their bigotry at this point. I wouldn't have been surprised if they made them all wear red hats.
I'm gonna come.
At long last, we arrive at the final scene where Nick Fury is getting on board the Skrull ship to go back to the space station. He asks his wife to go with him, and she agrees only if she can stay in her green form, which apparently he doesn't care. It's totally fine with him. So then he kisses the green lady, and then they walk over to a bright, shiny light on the spaceship, and then it just ends. Nick Fury is a sad and pathetic character who got a sad and pathetic ending to what has ultimately been a sad and pathetic series. Secret Invasion has the lowest ratings of any MCU project, and in terms of viewership, it is the second lowest on Disney+, with only Ms. Marvel being lower. Disney even tried to put the first couple episodes of this series on Hulu with a free trial, and yet still nobody watched it. This series has done irreparable damage to the MCU continuity and managed to give us yet more of the MCU that nobody wants to see in the form of Danny, who is now the most powerful being in the entire MCU. Again, I have to ask, how could any villain pose a serious threat to Earth now that Danny could single-handedly defeat pretty much anyone with no effort whatsoever? Despite the failure of this series, the showrunners are still talking about the possibility of a second season. Maybe they'll get it because for whatever reason, Disney loves to throw money away. But thankfully, that's the end of Season 1.
Taking shots at the enemy. I'm gonna make it to the top, leave a legacy. If I got something to say, you better let me speak. Turn it up a new degree, bitch, you ain't seen anything. I pop off with the new rock, electronic, blow the sonic